Let's look at the lovely Langmesser from Krieger Historical Weapons. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now many of you will realise that I've had this for a little while now. It was received I think about 3 months ago from Krieger Historical Weapons. Thank you very much to them for sending this to me for review. As always, disclaimer, this was sent to me for free. I didn't buy it. That's true of most things, about 90% of things on this channel, so they're all on the same even keel footing anyway. So I'm completely honest about these things that I'm reviewing. Right. First of all, you will know I like this. I've showed it in quite a lot of videos already, although I haven't done a full review of it, and that's what this is here, although I'm going to try and keep it relatively concise, hopefully. I like it, okay? In fact, I more than like it. I love it. And I think many of you could tell, as soon as I received this, I was very, very enthusiastic about it. And I have to be completely honest, this is one of my favourite replica swords that I have received in a long time, 1-2 years. It's certainly up there, probably in the top, certainly in the top 5. Possibly in the top 2 or 3. It's a really, really nice thing. Now that's partly because of Krieger Historical's craftsmanship. It's partly because of the specific weapon itself and the setup and the design and what I personally wanted for videos. I needed, or I wanted, shall we say, another Langmesser for videos. And I was very happy to receive this at the time that I did. I have worn this also in a living history context, and it very much is set up for that because in this case it comes with a scabbard and a belt set. And it's beautifully made, okay? Now, first of all, let's talk about the scabbard and belt, and we'll get to the sword in a second, okay? It is wood-lined, it is leather-covered, it is not stitched at the back, it is glued. It has impressed decoration on the surface of the leather that you can see there, which gives it an added quality and character that you might not get with other pieces. It's got very good quality brass fittings to the belt, on the belt end and the buckle. The leather is really nice quality. In fact, I'll just undo this for a second. You can see I've wrapped it up. This is one way of carrying a sword in period, which I've talked about in other videos. Let's just unwrap it. It goes on and wears beautifully and has one simple knot method here. Now, a lot of people who've looked at maybe high-end scabbard orders from specific scabbard makers will be actually more familiar perhaps with some of the more complicated ways of fitting belts to medieval scabbards. But actually, if you look at period medieval art, there are actually lots of very, very simple ways of attaching a belt to a scabbard. So you can just get a scabbard and a belt and attach them yourself. I'll deal with that in future videos. But this is a fairly simple, although this does have specially attached loops at the back of the scabbard here to actually prevent the belt sliding up and down. As opposed to risers, there's no risers that I can see, so they've used this little strap or cut incision method so you can insert the belt through. In fact, historically, certainly some scabbards didn't have any riser or any attachment, and the belt could slide up and down, and you can move it, or if there are multiple belts, you can slide them up and down to where you want them for wearing in different purposes, different fit, different angle of hanging, this kind of thing. This one is fixed, but it's only one single point of attachment, and you'll notice the way that this goes is the buckle end comes out the top, and the end that goes around the back comes out the side, and you just wear them, and it wears very, very comfortably, very easily. You've probably seen me wearing it in previous videos. The leather is good quality and supple. The belt also has little impressed decorations on it as well. So just a nice level of detail, and that's fantastic. So in terms of pricing, how much this costs you will depend where you buy it. Obviously, if you are buying this in the US or the EU or the UK, it will cost you different amounts based on relative taxes, VAT, and shipping and things like this. But just to give you a rough indication, if I look on HEMA supplies, for example, in the US, it's currently listed, although it's out of stock, it's currently listed at $540 US, and that includes the belt and scabbard and the whole lot. Now, bear in mind, compare like with like, often when you're buying a sword from another maker, there won't be any scabbard. So if you did want the scabbard and the belt, you're adding, you know, probably a couple of hundred at least dollars for that. Okay, so $540 actually sounds very reasonable for the quality of what you're getting here. In fact, very reasonable. This is, you'll note, a very good looking German style, or should we say German sphere. What do I mean by that? Let's just unpack that for a second. So Langmesser could be found all over Europe at this time. However, this particular setup has a sort of German feel to it, and it is a type of long knife or messer, Langmesser, that was popular in Germany and areas close to Germany. So, for example, Bohemia, kind of the eastern side of France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Flanders, and a little bit into England. There's some suggestion that some of these were sometimes made their way to England, parts of Scandinavia and so on. Okay, so basically if you look at what's modern Germany and then have a kind of blast effect out from it, that's where you would find weapons like this Langmesser. You didn't necessarily find them everywhere exactly of this design. For example, English hangers or falchions tend to be slightly different design to this. Equally so do northern French ones, Burgundian ones, so on and so forth. So you could find these in some areas outside Germany, but they are, I think, fundamentally a German setup of weapon. Now, you will see that this does not have an exposed tang. So many people think, I have noticed on the internet, many people think that one of the defining features of the Langmesser is a full width tang. That's not true at all. Many of these single-edged swords, whether you want to call it a Langmesser, a hanger, a falchion, any of these words you could use for it, whatever you want to call it, they actually often don't have a visible tang. They often have a concealed tang. Sometimes they have a normal tang like a sword, and sometimes you get wooden hilted swords without necessarily a metallic pommel that are peened at the end like a typical straight sword would be. So in fact there's a huge variety of constructions, and some of them are almost constructed a little bit like Japanese swords. So you have a tang inside, the wooden grip goes on, and then you have a pin going through, peg going through. But anyway, in the case of this one, this is kind of built a bit like how some kitchen knives are built. So it's a hidden tang that is secured by rivets, I believe. There's probably some glue in there as well, if I know modern sword makers. So it's essentially riveted onto the tang. There is no tang coming out the end, so the tang probably comes through to about that point, and it is concealed inside the grip. The guard, however, is actually riveted through with the nagel, okay, the nail, ironically, in this case, which is also a rivet, just to confuse matters, but the nagel, as it's called, which is a side guard here, which enables, if you're parrying with the flat or binding with the flat, the opponent's blade won't slide down, you won't lose control of it, and equally it won't chop your knuckle off, because it will come down and land on that nagel. So you get an extra tiny bit of hand protection from that nagel, very, very useful, especially if you're doing things like twerk or sverchow with the flat on the side of the blade. Particular techniques that are found in Langmesser treatises. So a very important element, and you know, as you'll see, even with English hangers of the 15th century, we often have a projecting lug out the side that in England in the Tudor period developed into a full sidebar, and you sometimes find that on the continent as well. This has a knuckle bow, which is something I absolutely love, because as I am principally in my fencing practice a sabreur, I love having a guard at the front. It's just a lovely thing. Now, an interesting thing about knucklebow guards, as we've seen recently, they also feature on English hangers of this period. This is something which obviously provides more hand protection, but in some cases, depending on the size and the placement and the shape of the knucklebow, can place limitations on hand protection that you wear. There are certain types of mitten gauntlet which won't fit in here comfortably. Some types of mitten gauntlet might. Certain types of German ones might. Big kind of so-called Milanese type of mitten gauntlets, often you will not have enough space between your knuckles and there in order to fit those in. So just to be aware that knuckle bows, they do provide a lot of hand protection for people that don't have gauntlets on, but certain types of gauntlets might not be wearable very easily with these knuckle bows. Obviously, if the knuckle bow was bigger, you could fit a gauntlet inside it, but this one's relatively close to the hand, as they usually are, and therefore, as you can see, the distance between my hand, if there was a big shell plate in there, it just simply wouldn't fit. In terms of gripping these things, this is really, really nice. Something I love about this sword is it's got quite an angular grip, and they're quite flat on the back. Now, that's wonderful for me because I love sticking my thumb up the back because I love doing sabre, but this is also something that was done with Dussac and Langmesser in this period as well. I'm not going to say it was done all the time, but we can see a whole bunch of treatises where the thumb is placed up the back, and it seems to have been so standard with Dussac that the practice weapons of Dussac actually have a place to stick your thumb on the back. They're actually built for it. So doing this is completely possible and comfortable with this sword, and it actually has a back which is so well adapted for it. It's better than some sabres are because it's really beautifully flat here, so it suits perfectly a thumb grip. And notice also it is long enough. The grip is, you might say, oh, it's overly long for the hammer fist grip, but given that this is a type of sword that you very likely might want to place the thumb up the back of, we've actually got perfect. For me, it fits my hand absolutely perfectly. My little finger reaches that bird-like beak down at the bottom, and I've still got place to stick my thumb up the back. So the grip for me is absolutely perfect, and I love the fact that it's overall got a sort of rectangular form, because that's absolutely awesome for edge alignment. I very much doubt, unless you're doing something incredibly wrong, you're not going to mess up edge alignment when cutting with this sword, because it just sits in the hand so well and you can control it so well. So you can probably tell I am a fan of the grip. I should also mention as well, before I depart the grip, so to speak, that the sword rings really like a bell, and that can actually be quite difficult to achieve with swords that don't have a through tang and are not peened at the end. So, you know, full credit to Krieger. They have done a fantastic job on this. And it's beautifully made and utterly solid. I've got to be honest, I haven't really I've cut a couple of water bottles with this, but I haven't properly cut much with this, and I haven't done anything that really would have made anything come loose. So in terms of durability, I can't really comment at this stage. The other thing I'd mention as well, so about the guard. So one of the things I really like about the guard, it is clearly forged, or at least it looks forged. I'm assuming it's forged. There are companies out there making swords, some quite high-end swords, where the guards, frankly, are cast. Now, that doesn't need to be a bad thing. So long as it's metallurgically created in the right way, it's not necessarily going to be brittle, it's not necessarily going to, you know, have strength issues or anything like that. But when you're used to seeing original medieval Renaissance swords, things that are forged have a different look to things that are cast. The way the edges and the corners and the forms, you can just kind of usually tell by looking at something whether it's cast or forged. And these types of guards on these types of swords would have always, and I'm going to get criticised for saying that, but let's say 99.9% of the time, have been forged. Okay, they might sometimes have had cast elements, I suppose, projecting shells or things like that, perhaps in the 16th century, but with some rare exceptions of where they were made of copper alloy, iron and steel guards like this would have always been forged. So I love the fact that it looks forged, it looks correct, it looks like an original wood. And also notice it's got this very characteristic, and Krieger have really researched their stuff, it's got this correct wedge form that comes up here with these kind of shoulders, which there are, you know, surviving originals which have that exact form. They've studied the originals. Although this isn't based on one specific surviving original, it's very much inspired by them. One thing I would note on that though is these corners, and I've found them on other makers, Langmessers as well, they can catch on things. Just be aware of that. You know, it is correct that they've done it like this because the originals are done like that, but just be aware that these corners can catch on your thumb. They can, if you're doing certain techniques, they can maybe catch on your knuckle if you're turning around to do things like this. Just be aware that there are corners there, and and on this they're fairly smoothed off. They're not rough, but you know, just to be aware. I would say the riveting there is not the tidiest in the world. It's not bad, but it could maybe be just filed a little bit smoother. It just looks a little bit rough in comparison to how the rest of the guard is finished. But it's not actually rough to the touch or anything like that. So that's not a major criticism, just a minor observation. And as I say, everything is rock solid. I can't flex or bend anything anywhere. That nagel is not going anywhere. You could hammer on that for ages without it moving. And the little hollow rivets that run through here, made of brass, are very, very nicely done. Now, let's have a look at the blade. So the first thing to say about the blade, it is straight. Now they do other models that aren't necessarily fully straight, of course, and they'll do custom things to your wishes, but I actually chose a straight one for a number of reasons. One, because I think that it's quite an interesting thing, a straight Langmesser. Also, straight ones are shown in Talhofer. Also, there is a tradition in England of single-edged swords being straight, and I quite liked that. That appeals to me. Also, I like the potential for thrusting that it gives. It basically means that you've got a single-edged sword that has good cutting potential, but also is as good at thrusting as any other straight sword, basically. So I thought it was interesting that from point of view. There is another element at all as well, and that is UK law. And quite simply, whilst I can get curved swords, katanas and everything else sent to me because I meet all of the legal defences that we now have under our ridiculous laws, it takes longer for me to get curved swords through than straight swords. So quite simply, it's easier and quicker for me to get straight swords to me than curved swords. So that was also kind of swayed my choice. And if you're a UK buyer, bear in mind you can import and own this with no legal restrictions whatsoever, so long as you're over 18. Okay, so there are certain other messers out there, and falchions definitely, that you might have trouble getting through UK border force because they're curved. This, however, you can just go, it's straight, it's straight, it's straight until they get it to your door, because it's straight and it's not covered by, it's not restricted at all under UK law. Okay, so UK friendly Langmesser for the UK people out there. Right, in terms of the blade, I absolutely love it. Now, one thing I should mention is that I was looking at the specs and I saw on HEMA Supply's website, this was listed as 855 grams. I weighed mine, and mine's actually 805 grams. Now, I'm not complaining. I love the fact that this is super light. And I mean, I can move this thing so quickly. It's got a lot of authority. I mean, you can see, so it balances fairly far out. I'll grab my tape measure in a second, but it balances quite far from the hand. So actually, it's got quite a lot of authority in the blow. But because it's light and because it's short and small, you can still move it really fast. So, you know, those things combine to make a brilliant little chopping sword. So I'm not complaining that, you know, I'm not saying I wish I had those extra 50 grams back, but just be aware that these, like all handmade swords, and I'm always reminding people of this, with handmade objects that are as finely dialed in as this, you know, they have a certain taper that's going to vary slightly. These are handmade, they're going to vary slightly. If they taper slightly in this way, they taper slightly in this way. The guards, not all of them are going to have the exact same thickness of the quillon and the knucklebow, and these easily add up to 50 grams difference. It is, anyone who's ever made, even knives, but anyone who's made swords, something as long as this, will know that you only have to have tiny differences in bits of the guard, bits of the grip, bits of the blade, bits of the profile of the point. And 50 grams can come or go so easily, okay? You can get a bunch of antique swords that look the same, feel the same, you weigh them all, and they easily vary by 50 grams, sometimes 100 grams. Okay, so, right, end of tangent there. So this is 50 grams lighter than it says on the page. So don't be disappointed if yours is. Don't be disappointed if yours is heavier than mine, but I would just say, you know, this feels fantastic at 805. I'm sure if it was 855 grams, I wouldn't have cared. I still would have loved it as a sword. I don't think there's any real tangible difference, because that 50 grams is spread all over the sword in different places. Okay, right. In terms of the blade itself, it is beautifully flat. We've got a little bit of rippling in it. These are handmade, hand forged, and it is, as you can see, it doesn't have a huge amount. It's relatively similar breadth here as it is to here. It really doesn't start to taper until maybe about the last 7 or 8 inches of point. It's fairly parallel up until that. And it has a narrow ground in fuller. Now, if I was being super picky, and I have to say, again, I love this sword, okay, really love this sword. I carry it around, I cuddle it, it's lovely. It's just a really lovely little thing. If I was going to change just one thing about this sword, possibly the one thing I'd do is make that filler a little bit broader, or a little bit deeper, or a little bit, I don't know. It's just, it's there, but it's not there, if you sort of mean. I feel like the fuller could be a bit more, and it would make the sword look even more awesome with a more awesome fuller, because it's a lovely blade, and I just feel like the fuller is a little bit weak, a little bit anemic. But anyway, that aside, otherwise I love the blade. The flex, great. You can see it stays stiff in the first half of the blade and flexes in the second half of the blade because it has distal taper. Okay, so it does have distal taper. But here is one thing that I think is the most, notable thing about the sword overall, is that it doesn't have a huge amount of distal taper, and that's because the blade is really quite thin at the base. So I just went and got my calipers out. Let's have a little look. At the base of the blade, wow, that is actually quite thin. At the base of the blade, it is 4mm. So my guess is they used 4mm bar stock for this. So it's 4mm. It's actually a shade. It's actually coming out as 3.9, but I suspect that's because I'm slightly up where I'm measuring. Because of the shape of the quill on, and I can't do it at the front because it's thinner. I suspect that it's 4mm, but because it's been polished, that's brought it down to 3.9. That's really quite thin. Now, I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. Let's just measure the rest of the, so if we go up to, let's just go to the middle of the blade, 3.3, and then a couple of inches down from the point, 2. Okay, so it definitely has, and the blade, incidentally, on mine is, let's have a look. It's 63 and a bit centimeters, or just under 25 inches. Now, that's quite a thin blade. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter functionally because the blade is broad. However, that is thinner than any of the originals that I've personally measured, and that is thinner of any of the originals that I've seen stats for. That's not to say that there aren't originals as thin as this. In fact, I'm certain that there are. Okay, so I don't feel, oh no, I've got an unhistorical sword here. In fact, no, I think that almost certainly there are historical parallels for having a 3.9mm thick blade down here. That being said, I would say it's not necessarily typical according to what I have seen. So it is on the thin, very much at the thinnest end of the spectrum. The broadest and thinnest swords that I have personally seen measured have been 4.1mm. So anything under 4mm does seem rather thin at the base. So possibly there is an argument for, in an ideal world, this blade would be better if it was beefed up to at least 5mm at the base, possibly 6mm at the base, and then with slightly more aggressive distal tapering. But that being said, you know what? It handles beautifully, it looks beautiful. I'm sure that there are historical parallels, especially bear in mind this is a broad blade and it's only 24 inches, 25 inches long. So the fact that it's only 4mm at the base of the blade, yeah, that's fine. But anyway, the only other thing which I find curious about this sword is that they have fitted inside the scabbard, and you will notice every time you draw, if you've got an oiled blade, I hope you'll be able to see on screen, can you see a line there? Right, so yes, it's that line there. If you've got a lightly oiled blade, and I keep most of my carbon steel blades lightly oiled, when they're in the scabbard, what that line is there's a form of leaf spring inside the scabbard. Now, as far as I'm aware, I've never heard of that being a historical thing. I've never heard of a leaf spring. Certainly there's leaf springs fitted up here in Victorian era scabbards and Georgian era scabbards, but down here in a medieval scabbard, I've never ever heard of that. And I actually asked Krieger about this because I was like, have you got some kind of spring, like leaf spring, catch spring like this? And they were like, yeah, we put that in to stop the swords falling out of the scabbards. Now the funny thing is this sword actually falls out quite easily. So I don't know whether maybe that was a criticism they received and they didn't want to tighten up the wood for some reason because of expansion and contraction perhaps, I don't know. And so they decided to fit a mechanical leaf spring in there. The downside to it is that it means that if you have an oiled blade, it leaves a line on your blade when you draw it out, which is not optimal. So I would personally say it would be better to do away with that leaf spring and actually have an internal, you know, maybe like even kind of fabric like velvet or leather, kind of gripper near the top, as some, you know, some scabbards are lined and they grip the blade better, or just make the wood tighter, I don't know. But anyway, that's just something to be aware of, so that I've mentioned it, because it's odd, and it is the oddest thing about this sword. So, to sum up, do I like this Langmesser? Hell yeah! If someone came to me and said, Matt, I want to buy a Langmesser, where should I get it from? I would say, Krieger Historical Weapons. That's right, they're great. They're great value for money. And honestly, I'm not going to name names of other manufacturers in this video, but you can spend the same money or more money for a Langmesser from someone else, and I don't think you'll necessarily get a better product. So I think these are really, really good if you want a Langmesser. And I should say, check out the links below to Krieger Historical Weapons, because they do a bunch of other things. They do blunt ones of these for training. They do feathers. They do longswords. They do all sorts of things. Now, I haven't seen their other stuff, so I can't make a judgment on those yet, but they look pretty good. So thank you again to Krieger Historical Weapons for sending this. Sorry that the review's taken a while to get done. One final thing, edge. Yes, I knew there was something I'd forgotten. So the edge of the blade, minor criticism. It ain't really sharp. Are you certainly not going to shave anything with that? But the edge geometry is awesome. This is a true, like, single bevel. Okay, it's got a micro secondary bevel. It's got a tiny bit of an apple seed at the edge, which I actually prefer anyway, because it makes the edge stronger. But I always say there are so many, and this isn't particular to Krieger Historical Weapons, there are so many companies selling knives and swords. And ultimately, what's the point of a knife? To cut things. If you send a knife to someone that doesn't cut, well, that's kind of a problem. Okay, so given that this is a sharp, yes, I can cut through water bottles to tiny map people, whatever, trees with this. However, if you can run your, and look, that's my bare skin, if you can run your hand on an edge like that, it's not really finally properly sharpened. It's a fantastic edge geometry, but I'm going to have to go away with my DC4 stone and make this the edge that I think it could be. But note, mark down, when I've done that, this thing I think will cut like a lightsaber, because it's a single bevel, almost single bevel, very thin, flat blade, great edge geometry, good steel, light, fast, point of balance, quite far from the hand. So this thing's going to cut like an absolute demon for its size. But, you know, minor criticism points there on the edge sharpness. Right, I know this has been a bit chaotic and rambling. I've done it all off the top of my head, but I think I've mentioned everything now. If you've got any specific questions about this, you can post them in the comments below, and if I get time, I'll be able to get you some more answers for those questions. But check out the links. You can find, if you're going to ask me about the measurements and stuff like that, you can find all of that on the websites. I'll tell you what, I'll put a link below to Krieger Historical Weapons, and also shout out to HEMA Supplies, because actually I found their data was easier to access than Krieger Historical Weapons was. Shout out to HEMA Supplies, my friends there, and you can see all of the stats and all of the details and more photos and stuff of this there. But yes, Langmesser, great option. There are others out there. There are other good makers of Langmessers out there, not to besmirch their efforts, but Krieger Historical Weapons, you're making lovely Langmessers. I'd like to see more variety. I'd like to see different types, and yeah, I'd be absolutely delighted to see these more widely available to other people, because I know that they're going to be popular. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. I will see you again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.